All right, now we're going to move into talking about wood recruitment. Another non-controversial, pretty straightforward, easy to talk about topic. We're going to start out with Michael Pollock, he's with NOAA, and Tom Spies, who's a research ecologist with PNW Research Station in Corvallis. They're going to talk about the effects of thinning on production of dead trees and stand structure. And my understanding is they're going to do a tag team, high-fiving, trading places in the middle of it. So help me welcome Tom and Mike.
Yep. Thanks, Cheryl. Nice to be here. Michael and I are going to do a tag team effort, partly to illustrate, I think, that sometimes I guess there's an opinion that NOAA and the Forest Service aren't always on the same page. But for at least 20 minutes, we're going to be on the same stage and maybe the same PowerPoint. What this emerges from is a scientific review team that's been meeting over the last year or so to deal with riparian zone management to provide some guidance to managers. And what we're going to talk about today emerges from that effort, and there's a bunch of other dimensions to it, and we're just only going to focus on the thinning part as it affects potential dead wood production. Also like to acknowledge Rob Pabst and Stu Johnston, who helped with some of the modeling effort that we're going to talk about, and also acknowledge Gordy Reeves and Tim Beachy, who shared in some of our fruitful and rich discussions about how to deal with riparian zones. So what we're going to look at basically in this short talk is what are the effects of thinning in plantations on dead tree production following thinning, the size of future dead trees and live trees, the different thinning prescriptions, including no thinning, and then different stand simulation models. And this last point comes out because when we did our synthesis of the existing studies, we realized there are very few studies that actually look at the effect of thinning on dead wood, even fewer that look at thinning on dead wood in riparian areas. And so we really had to kind of step back and use some modeling tools to help visualize and imagine what some of these effects might be. So everything you see today is going to be a result of some simulations in a computer, which you should take with some caution, but they're the best thing we've got at the moment. Also, just to help you visualize what we're talking about here, it's sometimes hard to know what 100 trees per acre looks like, or if you're dealing in hectares, what 247 trees per hectare look like. A lot of what we talk about when we talk about situations in riparian zones and in plantations is this type of a situation where we have almost, say, 300 trees per acre. And a lot of the thinning prescriptions that are kicked around these days range in this zone here between 100 trees to 60 trees per acre. So this to kind of give you some perspective. And then I would also like to say that when we talk about thinning, traditionally, foresters know what thinning is. It's something you do to capture the mortality in a stand and to improve the growth of the remaining trees. But when we get into Northwest Forest Plan and we get into other things besides the the live trees, we talk about dead wood, and that flips the whole thing around. Thinning to produce dead wood is, you've got to think in a completely different way. A lot of what we learned from our forest management books only focused on the live component and not on the dead component. So there's some things that don't translate very well, and it may seem like a simple observation, but in fact it's quite important, and sometimes when the discussions on thinning get going, you have to figure out where the different perspectives are. Is it from a traditional thinning perspective with regard to producing and improving the live portion of the stand in the future, or is it relative to producing dead trees, which is not something that thinning has typically been associated with. And so at this point, I'm going to bring my partner in here, and he's going to take over.
All right. I appreciate Cheryl providing humor. Hopefully we can continue with that. Let's see, effects of thinning on forest structure. Yeah, it is a little weird to step right into the middle of a talk, but Tom covered it nicely. I'm simply going to show a couple very simple concepts, which is the effect of model simulation thinning on dead wood production, and then live tree production too, as long as we're growing dead trees, we may as well grow live trees too and see what happens, for old school people. So this, let's see, does this work? God, my eyes are going. Which button?
Above the 2 arrows is the
Okay, okay, great. Okay, so we modeled, there's a group of stands. These are these circles here. We modeled 7 stands, which are the shaded squares. And this just gives you some idea of what we modeled. And to give you a sense of, I'm going to step through this and show you the results of various thinning treatments on these 7 stands. There's that. And then I just want to note that there's no high density stands that were modeled. So we're looking at, for the English unit, such stands that are around 250 trees per acre, okay, and then a density of, a DBH of around a foot or so. And then this was FVS we used, and this is in Northwest Oregon, and so we did some calibration against some of the FIA data just to get a sense, do we have it pretty much right? And after a little tweaking, we got it pretty much right in terms of stand age and average DBH, tree density. Interestingly, the tree heights were a little high, but we couldn't really get that quite down. They were still within the range, but just for there. So again, the focus is on mortality. It's on death on dead wood. And if there's one thing when you go to sleep tonight, just think dead wood. That's sort of and how do you grow it? That's really the kind of the crux of this. So this is the mortality rates, and it's 4 different treatments. There's a no-thin control, a 400 TPH thin, so this is around 600 TPH, down 400, 250, and 150. That corresponds, working back up to about 60, 100, and 150 TPA. And so you'll see those 4 figures again, and I'll just walk you through this. This is just showing you the 30 to 50 centimeter dead wood that is produced from the stand, and it's really showing you the peak mortality. So we've got peak mortality rates, and this is the no-thin control, and then this one down here is your heaviest thin. And it's really just to show you that in terms of that size class, the 30 to 50 deadwood size class, that's happening fairly early on in the process, all your mortality. This is the greater than 50. It's the same sort of pattern. It's a little more smoothed out. But again, your peak mortality of greater than 50 centimeters DBH dead wood is occurring fairly early in the process. This is years post-thinning. The stands were about 35 years old when we started this thinning. So, and then, it shows you really a pretty good taper in terms of deadwood production. Okay, so then this is really just looking at the same data, but looking at cumulative mortality to get a sense of what's the difference. And here, again, a little graphic to show you that the difference, if you don't thin, this is just one point I'm picking, but if you don't thin up here versus your heaviest thin, just for the most contrast, you've got about 196 trees in the no-thin control at that point, cumulatively produced versus 90. So again, we're talking about deadwood production. You got about twice as much. For that 50 centimeter and greater size class. For the 30 to 50, you've got about twice that much. I didn't show that here, but you got about 200 trees produced. 200 more, so about 400 total. And then note here, this is the 100 centimeters. So these are, if you're really trying to grow these big Hurricane trees, you really don't get a big difference in those. Pretty minimal effects, really within model error, unquantified model error, I might add. But it just gives you some sense of the relative effects, and then the more medium thins are in between. Interestingly, the heavy thin, that was what Paul had mentioned earlier about the hitting the stand hard enough to really open up the understory so you get light in and you can get understory development and such. That's about where your heaviest thin in this simulation is. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, so we did that. That's all the points there. All right, and then we looked at live trees, and it's a little bit more complicated here. Again, the 4 different simulations of thinning intensities, including the no-thin control. And I would just start off here to show, well, let's see, let's include all of them. What you've got is a difference in the production, and these are the 50 centimeter size class. These are the 100 centimeter size class. This is 150. okay, the comparisons. And what you see is that early on, post-thinning, your heavy thin really gives you a boost in production of live trees in greater than 50 centimeters. So that's this right here. But then if you follow this trajectory, the no thin versus the heavy thin, you see later on that your live tree production in that size class has decreased relative to that the no thin control ends up with more. So there's a short-term benefit, long-term, there's a trade-off between short-term and long-term, okay? And I'll just let this linger for a little bit because this is really the last big graph. And then here, here's a benefit you can see from thinning. In this case, here's your heavy thin, you're getting a bump. And I'm just picking 100 years post-thinning because it's just a convenient point, really. You're seeing that you're getting more of these large trees. You're getting 34 for the heavy thin versus 18 for a no thin control. So, sort of double the amount of the big, large trees. So, and then down here, if you really want the real big trees, 150 centimeter trees, you do see a bump in that from the heavy thin. Again, you're getting way out here in terms of, do I really believe this model when it's 200 years out? We can debate that, but all things equal, under the model assumptions, you do see a little bit of a bump of there of those big trees, but I don't think it's anything that important. So that's really it. Again, here, let me go back. I mean, this graph and this graph really show you the trade-offs that you get in terms of if you're trying to grow live trees for the sacrifice, or you're trying to open up the understory, that what you lose in terms of deadwood production and what you gain in terms of large live trees. So, I guess 99, those are just more numbers. Okay, and then this is really my last slide. And just, the reason we emphasize the deadwood, and we're talking about riparian, and there's going to be a lot of talk about it in streams, but is really simply that there's an awful lot of species out there that utilize deadwood or some aspect of it, whether it's downwood in the stream, downwood on the forest floor, standing snags or decomposed wood. There's just an awful lot of biological diversity in these temperate forests that is dependent on dead wood. So we have deadwood dependent species. And this is part of a big table that we produced, just going through the literature and looking at the ranges mostly of vertebrates. We're vertebrate biased here. And the size classes that they utilize. So, you can actually go and say, well, what species do I want to manage for? What suite of species? And you can look at least what the scientific literature finds that they use in terms of, say, roosting or nesting or things like that, or for in-stream habitat, what sizes have different functions in streams. And you can go through and you can kind of use this model approach to get some sense of what your effect is going to be on these habitat elements that are important for these various species. And that is, I think Tom mentioned, there's a report that's going to be coming out pretty soon, this collaborative project between multi-agency, interdisciplinary, et cetera. And here is Tom.
Back again. And so the word is thinning, not conventional thinning, has an impact, negative potential impact on dead wood. Well, is that the end of the story? Not necessarily, because if we thin with the notion of actually creating dead wood, the story can be quite different. And so we've done some modeling of an alternative approach, which is basically thinning the trees, killing them, dropping them in the streams, or however you want to do, but not removing them from the site. And in this case, then, thinning can actually accelerate production of dead wood by many times over a thin stand. This is illustrated here. Here's a simulation we've done with Zelig, which is a different stand model. And here's time from up to 100 years, and then here's cumulative snag production over time. Here's the plantation with nothing. It's sort of a no action. Somebody mentioned earlier, no action doesn't necessarily mean a beneficial effect. Here's where you thin once or twice and leave a few snags per acre. So you still see, even if you just leave 6 snags per acre, the cumulative production is greater in the unthinned stand. But now here's a situation where we thin it twice and we leave all the snags. So we go in and we do some thinning at certain densities and we leave the snags, and we actually then get more snags than you would get if you left the plantation alone. And so if you're worried about snag production, particularly in the early few decades, and you really want to get more dead trees, producing dead trees intentionally is the way to go. And this is a story for 10 to 20. Here's a story for 20 to 40, the bigger diameter. We can still get, the grow only is this line here, no action. But if you leave trees behind, or even leave some lower numbers of trees behind, you still get, for the first several decades, more trees than you would get if you didn't thin in the plantations. The story changes as you get out here, but at least for the early period, it's a different story than it is if you use conventional thinning. And then when we get into really big trees, the plantation doesn't produce anything during the 100-year period, and it's only when you get out to 80 to 90 years that you begin to see these other techniques producing the largest amount of dead wood. Now we also we use different models, as we often do, and the question is, do the models give you the same result? And of course, any of you who've used models know that they don't necessarily give you the same result. And this is what we found here from some very simple examinations. In this case, Zelig is the model that I just talked about here. Organon is Stand Management Co-op, Organon, Northwest Oregon variant, and FES. And this is 10 to 20 inch diameter trees with no thinning, so this is just let it grow. All four models show a somewhat different result. They all show, of course, more cumulative snags, but the rate at which that accumulates differs by the model. If we now go and add a thin to 90 trees per acre, we get a little more convergence, but there's still some strong differences. For example, Organon Stand Management Co-op doesn't like to kill trees as much as these other models do. And if we look at something 20 to 40 inch trees, we begin to see even more divergence here. Again, FES, in this particular way, it's parameterized. Now, you can parameterize them different. You can input different mortality functions in there, but you still, if you just take it out of the box, as we did here, this is the story, that there's some differences that Organon and FES were quite different. Zelig was somewhat in the middle. So while the general storyline is similar across the models, the actual details of the models will differ. And big trees, the same thing. FES is the only one that was really cranking out the really large snags in these particular simulations that we looked at. So the basic story from this little exercise was that conventional thinning generally produces fewer large dead trees compared to unthinned stands over the lifetime of the stand. Conventional thinning can accelerate the appearance of very large trees. They may come on line sooner, but that depends on the density of the stand and how you thin it. It's another one of these it depends answers. But you can accelerate big trees, big dead trees, and of course live trees by thinning from 1 to 20 years, depending on what those initial conditions are. Thinning that leaves some or all of the dead wood can more rapidly produce dead trees compared to unthinned stands. And so if the focus is really restoration of dead wood in a riparian environment where you've got lots of plantations, the message is just cut some trees and leave them there. It's pretty simple. But sometimes that simple message is lost when we think about thinning from a conventional standpoint or traditional standpoint. And then finally, assessments of thinning effects may vary depending on the stand model. So if you're really kind of comparing things, or if you're really doing different modeling, you better really look under the hood to what assumptions are made in those models, because they can have an impact on what you think future production of dead wood might be. So thank you.